Welcome back to the Faith Forward podcast. John Ackerman, Brian Bales, and it feels like it's been a minute.
Yeah, it is. I feel like you're welcoming me back in some ways. So, I took a mini sabbatical there for a couple of weeks, but good to be back.
Yeah. We were just sitting here realizing it's been about a month since it was just the two of us sitting here. We had Dr. Patty Broderick with us as we were finishing up the series on Complicated. Mm-hmm. And now it's time for Easter. Yeah. Because time flies.
It is. So we're digging into a new series. If you joined us on Sunday, you already know that. One of the things we say in this podcast and this platform is that we invite you to listen to whoever was speaking on Sunday at Christian Fellowship Church, because what we talk about in this podcast really is taking what was talked about there and allowing what God wants to speak to us in our life and taking our faith and moving it forward. So it's not that you can't listen to this without.
Right.
But I like to think it's helpful.
Definitely helpful. Especially this one. And I mean, we say that for most of them because it really is helpful. So, but like you said, we're in this season now of Easter, right? The anticipation of remembering. Yeah. The reality of the last few days of Jesus's life. And so in a second, you're going to talk a little bit about where you went on Sunday, but you've talked before about the challenge with Easter for most pastors, and you as one of them, is it's a story that a lot of people already know. And so how do I offer something new, something fresh, without it just feeling like fresh for the sake of being fresh? Yeah. Here's your hot take on Easter. But there's an invitation as well with the podcast to sort of wonder, all right, it's the Easter season. What on earth are they going to talk about that's practical? Got to be honest, I'm pretty excited for today's conversation. I really think there's going to be some good, practical, immediately applicable takeaways. So if you want to give us a sense of where you went on Sunday, we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so we named this series The Original Influencer. And if you're watching on YouTube, you're probably familiar with what's known as a social media influencer. And those people that we may see through Instagram or Twitter or whatever you connect with, Facebook, YouTube, who are paid, for lack of better terms, to push a product or to influence you in a particular direction. And the truth is, every single one of us are influenced, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what the question I began to ask and kind of peel back some things in our life on Sunday was this: number one, are you influenced by things that are good, but more importantly, then are you influencing by the right influences and things that are good? Are you influenced by the most important influence? Sure. And that is Jesus. He is the original influencer. He was there at the beginning. He was there at the fall. He was there at the cross. He was there at the resurrection. And he'll be there in the day when we go to heaven and we get a new body. He's always there. And the question isn't, though, whether or not he is the original influencer. He is. But the question isn't whether he's the greatest influencer. He is. Our question is, will we let him be that way? And so on Palm Sunday, what I found interesting is that in the book of Mark, and we started in Mark chapter 11, is Jesus was very, what I would like to say, subdued about talking to people and showing that he was king, that he was Messiah. In fact, many times throughout the Gospels, Jesus says, don't tell them, even if you know, don't tell them. But as we get to Mark chapter 11, Jesus begins to sort of makes this turn where he goes from, don't tell them I'm king, don't tell them I'm Messiah, but now exhibiting and taking on his kingly role in a way that's asking for things only a king can ask for. And in that section, in Mark chapter 11, verse 1 to 11, is this section of Scripture, what we call Palm Sunday. And in it, Jesus dealt with at least three distinct different audiences. He dealt with two disciples who we don't know who they were, but let's just say their names were Peter and James, just to make up two names that were disciples that we don't know. Yeah. And he asked them to do something that seemed very risky, but he could because he was king. But they had to recognize that. Then there was another group of people, specifically a group of people who saw this donkey being taken, or this colt, by these two disciples, as well as the owners. And Luke tells us it was the owners and some other people going, what are you doing? And they just say, the Lord, the king, has need of it. And they had a decision. Am I going to trust this valuable commodity? And an unridden colt, as I said on Sunday that day, was a very valuable thing. I just said, it's like a Mercedes. It's valuable. Maybe you have 6 of them. Maybe you don't have a Mercedes. Maybe you think it's a Tesla, or maybe it's just, a new Ford F-150 electric truck. Or for my friend John here, a Toyota Tacoma. right? Whatever it might be, asking for that. And then there was a third group of people actually on Palm Sunday that when Jesus enters into the city riding the colt, they recognize that's the entrance of a king. And their response to him was that of a king. But what we do know historically is that 5 days later, many of the people that were in that group of people who responded to him one way completely changed how they responded to him. And so what we're going to talk about is what does it look like for Jesus to be king in our life, to influence us that way? Because each group, as I said on Sunday, saw Jesus as king, but as we're going to talk about now, they saw Jesus in different terms. Specifically, one group saw Jesus in their own terms as king. And this is the point I'm really trying to drive home, is that Jesus on our terms, king on our terms, is really no king at all. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what we're going to dive into and ask some questions about. And I know from my own life that many times I've been really good with Jesus being king when Jesus asked me to do exactly what I wanted to do already. Mm-hmm. And then he seems to ask from time to time things that I wouldn't want to do at any point in my life. But because he's king, because he's my savior, because he should be my greatest influence, I should say yes into those and trust him. But I struggle. And sometimes, truthfully, I don't recall actually verbally saying no, but everything about my actions and the way I've done it, even if it's I've just went the other way or I've dragged my feet really long and felt like he's dragged me kicking and screaming or whatever it might be, I've said no. Mm-hmm. And so that's really what we invite you into this conversation today. What does it look like when we examine our life that Jesus is our king? Not just king because we call him king, but is he really king in our life in the way we respond and what he asks and how we trust him?
Yeah. And this, I want to encourage you to be as aware of yourself and your own reactions today as you can, because if we're not careful, the ritual and routine of Easter can sort of numb the mind to new information, to new revelation.
Yeah.
Right? Because I know this, right? And there's nothing wrong with the comfort of routine and ritual. Mm-hmm. That's part of what routine and ritual is for. It is comforting. It is valuable. But sometimes it can put us to sleep.
Yeah, because routine and ritual is not designed for us not to think. Actually, right. The routine and ritual is designed to point our attention, to point our thoughts towards a particular way. Right. And there are times, I think, where routine and ritual does that really well. But sometimes, say with Easter, maybe because we know the story so well, we don't really engage the thought really well. I always have this sort of picture in my mind. I used to work at a church that had a church camp. And at the church camp, like lots of church camps, they had horses that rode on the trail. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. Those horses could have had no one on their back, asked them to do nothing, could have just been let out of the gate. They all would have walked in a line behind each other around this trail simply because that was the ritual they were used to doing. And in the same way, it doesn't mean you're not riding a horse, but you weren't getting all the stuff. And when ritual becomes that way in our life, where it's just basically mind-numbing, because I didn't have the balance. I could have fallen asleep on that horse.
Right.
I could have done no direction whatsoever, and I will bet a significant amount of money they would have gotten me right back to the same place.
Yeah.
So ritual, while it does have some comfort, isn't designed to make us disengage our brain, isn't designed to make us disengage our heart, our emotions, and our will. In fact, rightfully done, rituals like looking at Easter and the sacrifice that Jesus Christ made and his resurrection over sin, death, and the grave is supposed to point us in a particular way where our thoughts and our emotions and our will are properly aligned to how he wants us to work.
Yeah. And so the goal today, rather than comfort, is to embrace the discomfort.
Yeah.
All right, to step
And people are turning off right now, right? Yeah, exactly.
It's good to see you guys. We'll see you next time. Because as you were describing Jesus' entrance into the city in particular, we know that some folks in that crowd were ecstatic that the king was entering the city because they had been awaiting the king of the Jews to come and overthrow the Romans. And so they were getting their king on their terms as far as they knew.
Yes.
And they were 100% on board. Some of the people that were entering in knew Jesus as teacher, as this prophetic individual who was able to do these incredible things, and they were welcoming him in because they wanted more of those incredible things, right? More healing, more profound teaching. Give us more of what you're giving us, Jesus. We're on board for that. But you're right, as he's entering in, he's already doing some disruptive things. Hey, that colt over there, it's actually mine
Mm-hmm.
because I'm the king.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want you to go bring me what's already mine. You're not asking for permission for someone to donate to my cause. You're going to take this because it's mine and bring it to me because it's mine.
And you've got to agree that it's yours. Otherwise, the answer is stealing.
Yes.
And that's the tension.
Yes. And so the invitation here is for us to critically assess where we are in that crowd.
Yeah.
How we're seeing the king ride in this Sunday, and who it is that we're seeing on that cross and then being resurrected next Sunday. Is this the king on our terms, or is this the king?
Yeah.
And if we're being honest, there was a book that I read years ago. The title, I'm a sucker for good book titles. It was called My Imaginary Jesus. It's a great title, and it was an even better story. And the guy was basically talking about all these different sort of permutations of the imaginary Jesus that we create.
Yeah.
There's meek and mild Jesus. There was a biker Jesus, which was kind of fun. There was a half dozen different iterations of this is my version of Jesus. There's only one version of Jesus, the king. But if we're being honest, we've created our own version of Jesus. And just, as you know, I look at your notes, I let the thoughts flow, and I came up with just two alternatives, neither of which are biker Jesus. I have to let that one stand on its own. But the first one, and part of the reason why these came to mind is because I've been guilty of making these my imaginary Jesus.
Yeah.
The first one was Jesus' sidekick. And you want to go the Batman and Robin route, or whichever superhero pairing you're most a fan of, right? The sidekick doesn't get trusted with the really important things. You get sort of the minutia. And so I've been guilty, and I know others have as well, of the extent to which Jesus gets to be king in my life is he's king over minimizing traffic when I want to get someplace. He's king over finding me a parking spot when I arrive at wherever I'm going. And he's king of protecting my downtime so that I get to rest when I want to. That's not Jesus as king. That's Jesus as sidekick. That's Jesus, I do the heavy lifting. You take care of the administrative details that make the rest of my life work. And prove yourself competent there. And I'll invite you further.
It's interesting you said that I do the heavy lifting and you take the details. And I think that's true. Sidekick. I think there's a way to think about sidekick that sometimes reflects in my life and maybe reflects in your life this way as well. Actually, I do everything else and I only give you the heavy lifting. I get to determine what's heavy because, see, as leader, I get to determine what I give to you as the sidekick and I get to keep what I want. So I get the fun stuff. I get the things that seem like I should be able to handle them. Notice all the caveats there. Seem like I should. And then I give him all the stuff I know that I can't.
Yeah.
And again, that's not king either. Nope. I don't get to selectively choose what belongs to him and what belongs to me. That's not my position. That's not my role. And I think that happens, actually, sidekick, when we begin to see things through a lens, John, intentionally, unintentionally, that aren't really the way they are. Many times on Sunday, and I didn't put these in any notes, and I didn't put these in any notes here, but it just reminded me, I've spent some time in this passage before, and there's several passages in the Gospels that talk about the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. One of the things when you get down to it is there could have been one animal, there could have been two animals, we don't know, but we know that he came in riding Zechariah 9:9 on a donkey, on an unridden colt of a donkey, right? When you back up and do a little bit of history, that was the way a king entered. When he entered in a parade for peace, when there was a victory parade from war, he entered on a different animal. He entered on a horse. And so what I find this interesting to be is this something that we might not in our culture know or see, but people in that culture absolutely knew that. But yet here it is right in front of them, him living out this symbol, them recognize him as king, but misunderstanding his role because right in front of them, it was the king of peace. King, that's what he came to bring in that moment, but they wanted him the king of judgment. which, by the way, when we look into Revelation, he's going to be riding a white horse, and it's going to, down his leg, going to say King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is going to ride that horse, that animal, at some point. It's going to be a big deal. But it just strikes me how easy it is, though, to, again, begin to decide this is the role he should play at this particular time, even when he says it's not that way. And so for me, when you're talking about sidekick, I immediately just began to say, that's really interesting. That's the way that you think through that. I just think through it. I don't want the heavy things. I want to do, and interesting, what might be not heavy for me might be heavy for you. So it's all relative, or vice versa. But I think we just take this down. That's not who he is at all. The king, because if we're sitting in front of the king and we recognize him as king, and I don't know if this helps you take your faith forward. It does for me sometimes. I've got to stop and actually visualize who Jesus is in front of me. I'm in the room in front of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. That's who he is. Would I be acting the same way I'm acting right now if I lived in light of that reality? And too many times the answer is no. I wouldn't come in and go, oh, by the way, I'm one of your subjects, you're the king, I want you to take this and you take that. And so the sidekick is there. I love this idea, though, also that you mentioned, the troubleshooter. What did you mean by that? You may have been the same thing by troubleshooter that I just flipped the other side.
Yeah, no. So this was like next level. Jesus' sidekick is maybe too irreverent for, you're like, no, I could never do that to Jesus. We may have. It's a good thing to check.
Sure.
Not just, right? And that's what we're trying to be today, is extra self-aware in this place of familiarity. But the next option up, the thing that came to mind was the Disney movie Aladdin, right? The genie and the lamp.
Yeah, the original one, for the record,
yeah. Right. Will Smith, good job too. But Robin Williams forever. And, the genie's line, when he's self-describing his reality, right, because Aladdin has this different take. He looks at the genie's life and thinks, man, you got it made. And the genie's response is, yeah, sure, phenomenal cosmic power, itty-bitty living space.
Yeah.
And how often have we done that with the King of Kings? That, all right, Jesus, I'll allow you to take your throne as a powerful entity, but you actually don't get total access to me. So I'm going to trust you to be the troubleshooter in my life. I'm going to trust you to not only deal with minimizing traffic and getting me parking spots, but you are actually the one that I trust to have the power to make things work out, to not only be the provider of parking spots, but the provider of all of our needs, financial, medical, all of it, to be the healer during times of trauma and sickness, to be the rescuer, right? Jesus, I and again, notice the language, I trust you with this power. Jesus, I'm giving you this colt. Jesus, this is my colt and I'm giving it to you. Jesus, I'm trusting you with these things that are mine because you are more powerful than me. You're the genie in the lamp, though. Let's just make sure we understand this. You have phenomenal cosmic power, but itty-bitty living space because this is mine. That's not the King of Kings.
Yeah. The other analogy is like, it was really clear who was the master and who was the servant. All of this cosmic power, but, the wristbands had him bound to doing this particular thing in this particular way. And I think as you're talking through this, I know, John, as we've talked, and as even seen on this note, we're not saying that we can't invite Jesus as king in our life to troubleshoot.
Yep.
We can't.
He's good at that.
We're not saying that we can't ask him to provide a parking spot. I was just recently in Washington, D.C., and I took my parents down. My dad had never seen cherry blossoms, and he wanted to go see them. And my dad has some health issues, and so I had what I like to call the Magic Pass. And if you don't know what the Magic Pass is, if you go into downtown D.C., I do not mean this disrespectful at all, but if you happen to have a handicap placard, it makes your life so much easier with parking. Well, I didn't realize, because I just didn't know, that when you go down to D.C., during cherry blossoms, they shut down all this area, and the vast majority of areas that they shut down are the place where the handicap parking is. So I'm driving around all kinds of places. I found two They were full. I was able to drop my parents off, but then I had to go find parking. And I found myself literally going, God, can I find a parking spot, right? And there was nothing wrong with that. I mean, and by the way, I don't know if it was answered prayer, grace that's just extended. I got one like 4 minutes away, which was, and by the way, after driving around for I don't know how long trying to find a parking spot, I felt grateful for it. Yeah. It's not wrong for those sort of things. The emphasis, what we're trying to put is if that's all he is, if that's all he is, because the King of the universe, the King of our life, he loves us enough to give us a parking spot. He does. But he loves us to do so much more than that in that way. And again, so there's a role that God is wanting to play in our life. Are we allowing him to do it? Which is really interesting because this is the one place where Jesus as king works a little bit different like an earthly king. The earthly king doesn't care what you allow.
Right.
But our King, Jesus, loves us enough to give us some free will, show us some grace, and invites us, as you often say, into something greater. Earthly kings often just expect us into whatever it might be. And there's some expectation, too, that Jesus has of our life. So I don't want to just say that he doesn't have expectations, but the way that he approaches it. And I think, though, as I was looking through some of the questions you were asking, one of the reasons in my life about allowing Jesus to be king that I can struggle with and taking my faith forward is fear. I can couch it in a lot of other words, like, well, he has too much power, has too much control. But ultimately, why should I be concerned about the God of the universe having too much power in my life? Why should I be concerned about the one who loves me enough to die for me to have too much control? I mean, there's no real reason that I should be other than fear. What am I fearing? You know, there's a lot of things I could be fearing, maybe a lot of things that you could be fearing as well. But I think this is one of those moments where if you're unsure, this is the time in the podcast that we come to where we say this, ask God. Right? It is the one thing. If we just got on and talked for 10 seconds, we go, hi, this is John, this is Brian, welcome, ask God, have a good day, right? And we don't make light of that. We don't, because that is the most powerful tool that you have at you, because you have the God of the universe as a believer inside of you, wanting relational connection with you. And so he could point out, hey, this is where the fear in your life is, because, Brian, we just did a series on church hurt. And I mentioned it in the series about fear. I just happened to mention it when I was talking to Dr. Patty, on that Sunday, where I only ever told Jesus two things I would not do. And one of them was be a pastor. And the reason why was the fear that I had behind what it would cost me, the pain, or what I had, just this thought process that was wrong. And being a pastor sometimes has been painful, been hurtful, but there's been nothing nearly as painful or as hard as the blessing is doing what he's asked us to do. And so I think for some of us, why we want to keep him in that sidekick role, why we want to keep him not as having the full aspect in our life, is because we're afraid. And if we find ourselves afraid, this is one of these moments where we can't miss this part of Easter week. Jesus died for you. He died for you. Colossians chapter 1 says he holds the whole world in his hands. He is all-knowing, all-powerful, and here's the thing, all-loving, and he wants to put that to work for us. And so in those moments where I said sometimes I have to visualize, if he's king, how would I be? At the same time, I like, do I really believe this? Do I really believe this is who he is? And what is, we got to welcome him. We need to welcome him even when he's doing something we don't want. When we want the king of war, as they did, and instead he's the king of peace. And that's hard.
It is. And so that's got to be practical step number one, as we're trying to be intentional about what we've done with Jesus in our life. Is, you had mentioned it, there were a lot of people that showed up for his entrance into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And we don't know for sure, but we're fairly confident that many of them did not show up at the crucifixion because it wasn't the Jesus that they were hoping for. There was a lot of disappointment. And so one of the things that we have to do is come face to face with our disappointment. And that's hard, because telling Jesus that you're disappointed in him, like you can't even get the rest of the words out of your mouth.
Yeah, which brings us to what you're going to expand on. In case you missed the second practical step, Jon was just saying is this: be honest with Jesus about your disappointment.
Yeah, be honest with Jesus about your disappointment. Because I think one of the things that we often rush past is, I can't tell Jesus I'm disappointed in him. That's irreverent. It's not spiritual. It's blasphemous.
And it's also not new information to him, right?
And
That's
it's
the
not
catch.
new information, right? That there's, it reminds me of the moment after, not only after the crucifixion, but after the resurrection. Jesus on the beach with his buddies, with Peter, and he does a lot of things in that moment that I wish were better unpacked in the scriptures, but even his disciples, I think, were a little disappointed, right? There's a reason, multiple reasons, but they scattered as he was arrested, right? And Peter ran when he was associated with Jesus, right? There wasn't a lot of turnout for the worst parts at the end.
Mm-hmm.
There was some disappointment. There was some fear. And we're going to circle back to that one in a second, so don't think we left that one behind, right? But there was some disappointment as well. This didn't go the way I thought it was going to go, and you weren't who I thought you were going to be when it mattered most. And there has to be a moment where we can be honest about that disappointment with Jesus.
And the honesty isn't that what we're saying is correct.
Yeah.
The honesty is this is how we feel, and this feeling is having an effect on my relationship with you, God.
Yeah.
And that step of being honest is another way of confession. Confession, again, is not repentance. That's different. Confession is acknowledging something that's true. And the acknowledgement in that moment is this is how I feel. Not that necessarily this is true about you. This is how I feel. And in that moment, then, inviting God into that space to speak to what he wants to speak to in the midst of your fear, in the midst of whatever it might be. I know that I think specifically back to that analogy of being a pastor, that I wish I could say that I have zero fears of being a pastor anymore. I wish. But I have more than a few still, and they pop up from time to time. Mm-hmm. And they're always some sort of different version of this, that I'm going to be on my own, that something is going to happen and everything's going to go wrong, and I'm just going to be left to pick up all the pieces again.
Yeah.
And in the midst of that, I know that's not true, but the longer that I live with that feeling and the thought, the more that it makes me even more fearful. It builds on that and affects my relationship with Jesus. And so I have to invite him in. So practically, what we're saying is what you're feeling in that moment, what you're thinking in that moment, because our thoughts are lots of times, they're not right either. Mm-hmm. But that is that first step to inviting God in and saying, God, I confess, I trust. Then being honest. This is how I feel. This is what I'm thinking in this moment. Now I'm inviting you into this moment.
Yeah. And I think too often we try to just skip past it, right? We suppress it. We minimize it. Jesus, just do whatever you're going to do. And that's often not the way that he works. Over the last year or so, I've been coming across lots of different writings from C.S. Lewis. And man, that man could write some really profound things in really simple ways. But I came across this quote. It's from a book that he wrote just after his wife died. And so talk about disappointment. I talk about loss, talk about heartache. And he writes this line about needing to be honest with who he thought God was and who he's discovering God is. And not in a way that's causing him to lose faith. It's just causing him to reassess what's true. But he said, my idea of God is not a divine idea. It has to be shattered time after time. He shatters it himself. He is the great idol smasher. And what he's getting at here is that we often feel like who I think Jesus is who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And so again, the people lining the road on Palm Sunday, they thought they knew. They would have bet the house on whatever they thought he was coming to do.
Yeah.
Because they'd seen him do it, or they felt like it was promised, or they knew that it was in the scriptures that this day was coming, right? And God himself is showing them that he's not who they thought he was.
Yeah.
He himself is smashing their false idols of God to show them who God is. And that's part of what God will do with us, is our idea of God is not a divine idea. It's not perfectly held in our human minds and our human hearts. It's a continual discovery and recovery of who God is. And so when we've discovered that who we thought God was is not, in fact, who God really is, we have to deal with that disappointment with him if we want to move forward with him.
There is clearly a temptation that sneaks up on us that we don't see or we embrace, that I heard someone say this way: Jesus is not made in our image, we are made in his.
Yep.
By that, there's just a turn of phrase saying what you're saying. We're made in the image of Jesus, we're made in the image of God, but he's not made in our image. And so our thoughts are not his thoughts. Our ways are not his ways. And yes, we have the mind of Christ in us and that sort of stuff, but there's that balance where I have to say, okay, if this is my thought, superimposing it upon Jesus, or is this really what Jesus said? And what's so interesting is there are times, and this is so why you have to ask God, where we can even get in other groups of people who are like-minded, and even like in desire to serve Jesus.
Yep.
But in that likeness, begin to get groupthink. Mm-hmm. And in that groupthink, might even well-intentioned, we are creating a caricature of the king that he's never revealed himself to be.
Yeah.
We limit his kingship, or we think this king's supposed to look this particular way and this particular way. And somehow or another, we've let this sort of come in. And we have this sort of idea, to use the term that comes out somewhere, of a syncretistic Jesus, that we take the truth about Jesus and we then synthesize it together with something that isn't true, and what you have as a result is a not true Jesus, but we think that it is. Yeah. And so we have to let God smash those idols. And sometimes even those idols, as Lewis would refer to, I think he would say it this way, never want to speak for C.S. Lewis, is that we can think those idols are good things.
Yeah.
We often think idols is this idea of all these negative things, and they're just anything that comes before who Jesus is, or that makes the reality of who he is different than the reality of who he is. I don't know if I said that well. I want to use the term obfuscate, but I figured that was kind of a big word for me. But obfuscates, so to speak, who Jesus is. Yeah. And then it becomes a Jesus made in our image is actually no Jesus at all. A king on our terms is actually no king at all. Yeah. And that's really what we're trying to push through in this, as we saw the tension. And hear me this, there is tension in all three groups of people in this section. The two disciples and what they were asked to do from kingly authority. That, I had this moment, I wrote it down if I did it well on Sunday, but I love it when Jesus has this moment, like, if they ask you what you're doing. I could almost hear the disciple, what do you mean, if they ask? Of course they're going to ask. I mean, of course they're going to ask.
It's like Grand Theft Donkey. Like, yeah, exactly. Come on. Somebody's going to say something.
Of course they're going to ask. But that was a reach. It was a reach for, what am I going to let the king? And then we have this, and I know this for a fact. If you're following after God, my guess is you're going to find yourself in your life in one of those seats, one of those audience from time to time, and maybe even in the same day, all of them. Mm-hmm. So, that's the practical step, be honest. So there's a practical question that we want to get to as we close, right?
Yeah. So sometime last year, and I forget when this was, but I was doing a little bit of complaining to God about what he wasn't doing that I thought he should be doing. And it felt like this very profound question came from him in response. He asked me, Jon, do you want me to be who you want me to be, or do you want me to be who I am? And I have to confess, it took me longer to answer that than I would like it to have, because there was a real temptation to, wait, is there a possibility that you could be who I want you to be?
Or like, could you tell me all that who you really are, and then I get to choose? I just kind of want to know.
Right. But it didn't take all that long, because not only is it obvious because I know it to be true, but the answer is obvious because it's what my heart truly desires. That what I truly desire is for God to be who he is in my life, not who I want him to be. Even as there are desperate places in me that really would just love it if we could slap some genie collars on Jesus's wrists and have phenomenal cosmic power at my disposal.
And just for the record, if anyone ever clips this podcast and that's all they talk about in this podcast, they're taking it really out of context. What was just happening?
Which they will probably not get that in the clip, but I appreciate that.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. But for the other people, later on, we addressed it.
Yeah. And so here's the other practical question. And we're wrapping this up earlier than we usually do, because I think it's probably more important to spend time thinking about this and asking God about this than it is continuing to hear options. But take some intentional time. If you're driving and listening to this, maybe wait until you've parked the car in whatever spot Jesus has provided for you miraculously. But get quiet and spend a little bit of time and ask him the question, Jesus, what would you get to touch in my life if you were truly riding in as king? And let that question sit for a while. Jesus, what would I let you touch in my life if I truly allowed you to ride into my life as King of Kings?
And in that invitation that Jon's giving you, we can't choose what could seem to be a really good answer, but many times it's a cop-out, like everything. Yeah. Just get specific in this way.
Yeah. If you say everything, you're actually not engaging with him.
Yeah.
And so, allow him to bring things to mind that he would like to touch because they're his. Again, it's the difference in the owner of the colt going, yes, Jesus, this is yours, take it. And yes, Jesus, this is mine, I'm giving it to you. There is a fundamental difference in how you perceive Jesus as king in those two responses.
Yeah.
And so what would it look like if Jesus rode into your life today and you saw him as King of Kings and he said, I want to touch that? Would your response be, of course, Jesus, it's yours because you're the king? Or would your response be, I'll allow you to, Jesus, because it's mine and I love you? Right? That matters. And so make this specific. Make this time with him specific and be aware. Be aware if he's pointing out something and what comes up in you first is fear. And that's okay. It doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you don't have faith. It means you're normal. Right? Because what Jesus is after is more and more of us truly surrendering to him as who he is, not just who we want him to be. And so it's okay if there's a little bit of fear. Those two disciples, I would imagine, were wrestling with some fear as they're going in for Grand Theft Donkey.
Yeah.
I have to imagine. But they went because they were recognizing that Jesus is who he is. And so it's okay if there's a little bit of fear. Be willing to navigate that. Be willing to navigate that with Jesus. It's okay if you're afraid that he will do something or not do something if you allowed him to ride into that part of your life as king. But navigate that with him. There really is no better way to navigate that fear than to allow God to talk to you about who he is. You can't self-will yourself to this place, in part because it doesn't work, but in part because that's not actually surrender to the king. That's, again, relying on yourself.
Yep.
And so what we're really after is allowing Jesus to be who he is, not just who we want him to be. And so with that, thanks for engaging with this today. Thanks for taking the ritual, the comfort, the familiarity of Easter and allowing it to be something that's uncomfortable, both as we engage Sunday morning, as we engage here, and as we engage with this week, because we want more of him. We want more of who he is, not just who we've come to know him to be. And just so that we're all clear, Brian and I are very much doing the same thing with all this, right? We've not yet arrived either. We continue to discover places where Jesus needs to be allowed to be who he is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as always, thank you for allowing us to be on our own journey, even as you allow us to be on yours, be part of yours. But
yeah,
good to be back. So we'll see you all in a couple weeks with the next episode after Easter. So happy Easter, everyone.
Happy Easter.